Happy Monday, guys! I'm sorry I can't be there today, but don't you worry, I've got this lesson for you here. So we'll be working on Unit 1, Lesson 4 notes, talking about conditional statements, and from there, converse, inverse, and contrapositive statements, which is just really manipulations of the original conditional statement. Okay? So a conditional statement is an if-then statement. It has a hypothesis and a conclusion. Right, so a conditional statement is an if-then statement. And it has a hypothesis and a conclusion. It has a hypothesis and a conclusion. And we'll learn later a little bit more about notation, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it in here. Our notation for this is T implies Q, and we use an arrow for the word implies. Alright? And so we think of this, we read it as if P, then Q. So think of it as if P, then Q. Alright, so again, it's an if-then statement. Alright, so the if part is the hypothesis. And again, we think of that when we're looking at our notation, that's the P. And the then part is the conclusion. And again, when we look at the notation, we're talking about Q here. Alright, so when we have a conditional statement, that first part that comes after if is the hypothesis, and the part that comes after then is the conclusion. Alright, and note that statements in English can be made without using the words if and then, but they are understood. Okay, so you have to be careful of that. Just because it doesn't have the words if and then doesn't mean it's not a conditional statement. It very well could be a conditional statement, but just not include those words. So for example, at 12 o'clock, the bells will chime. Notice we don't have the words if and then, but it is still a conditional statement. What is the hypothesis? Well, the hypothesis is 12 o'clock. Right. And the conclusion? Well, what happens at 12 o'clock? At 12 o'clock, the bells will chime. So our conclusion is that the bells will chime. Let's take a look at another example. If it rains, then the football game will be canceled. So here we have a nice if-then statement. If it rains, then the football game will be canceled. So the hypothesis comes after the if. If it rains. So our hypothesis is it rains. Then the football game will be canceled. So the conclusion, if it rains, the football game will be canceled. So our conclusion is what comes after then. And we have the football game will be canceled. So our conclusion, the football game will be canceled. And I'm not sure if there's two or one L there. I don't know. The two L's kind of look funny. Let me erase that. Alright, so here we have a typical if-then statement. If it rains, then the football will be canceled. Alright, if P, then Q. I'm going to go and throw in those letters P and Q so you can take that notation there. If P, then Q. P being it rains, Q being that the football game will be canceled. Okay, let's take a look at another one where it's not necessarily in that order. So our next example says, I will go shopping if I get paid today. So I will go shopping if I get paid today. So our hypothesis here is not just that first chunk. Again, the hypothesis is the if part. What is that first condition that is made? And that's why it's called a conditional. We have that condition on it. All right? So I will go shopping if I get paid today. So our hypothesis here is actually I get paid today. It's still that part that comes after the if. Okay, so then our conclusion, well, if I get paid today, what's going to happen? I will go shopping. So my conclusion is I will go shopping. And again, notice that it's not necessarily that second part. Here it's actually that first part. But think about it, we could switch around and say, if I get paid today, then I will go shopping. So sometimes you can take those conditional statements without the if then and put them into an if then. For example, if it is noon, or if it is 12 o'clock, the bells will chime. If it is 12 o'clock, then the bells will chime. You can make that into an if then statement. So be careful with this one where the order is not the same as what we've been looking at. Alright, so a conditional statement, that's again an if-then statement. You can kind of think of it as a diagram here. Let me draw this for you. You can kind of think of it as, let's say this entire area in here is Q. And then we have inside of it an area that is P. So P belongs to Q, but Q doesn't necessarily belong to P. Let me go ahead and shade this in here for you. Alright, so this is kind of like that example we were talking about last class, where we say all humans are mammals, but not all mammals are human. So we could say, if you are a human, then you are a mammal. Notice Q would be that entire region of mammals, that big group of mammals. But P is just that small group, the human part, that first condition. So if you are human, then you are a mammal. But it's not necessarily true the other way. It's not necessarily true that if you are a mammal, you are a human. Okay, so we have, again, conditional statements, the if-then statement. And we have branched off from there. Every conditional statement can be written as a converse, inverse, and a contrapositive. And these are really, again, just a manipulation of our original conditional statement. Alright, so let's take a look at converse. So converse is actually, you just switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, so you just switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So what we have there then is instead of if P then Q, we flip-flop it. We would have if Q then P. Alright, so we're flip-flopping it there. That's the converse. Alright, the inverse. The inverse is actually where we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion of our original conditional. So we take whatever that statement was and make it negative, both the hypothesis and the conclusion. Alright, so inverse, we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion of the original. The conclusion of the original, that conditional. So that's our original statement. Alright, so for our inverse there, you can think of this as if not P, then not Q. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and write this up here. If not P, then not Q. And that's my inverse. Right, so if not P, then not Q. And then can you guess what the contrapositive is? This is actually combining the two together. So this is where we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion of our converse. So notice the converse is where we switch it. And then the contrapositive is after we have switched it, then we negate it. So it's combining the converse and the inverse together. All right. So our contrapositive is negate hypothesis. That's hypothesis and conclusion. Of the converse. Right, so again, that's like the converse plus the inverse. In fact, if you want to do this, converse plus inverse equals contrapositive. Right, so what we see with that then is you can think of it as if not Q, then not P. I'm going to write that down here. If not Q, then not P. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at actual examples of these. So our first example, if you are a student, then you have lots of homework. This is our conditional statement. Right? If you are a student, then you have lots of homework. So that's our conditional. I'm going to go ahead and underline the hypothesis and underline the conclusion. Our hypothesis is you are a student. Think of that as your P. The conclusion, you have lots of homework. Think of that as a Q. I'm sure you guys are experiencing that right now, already having lots of homework. So if you're a student, then you have lots of homework. All right, so the converse, we're just flip-flopping those. So our converse is going to be, if you have lots of homework, then you are a student. Sorry, I'm not sure why Smartboard isn't working so well. Then you are a student. So again, notice we just flip-flopped the hypothesis. So our inverse is going to negate our original conditional statement. All right, so if you are not a student, if you are not a student, then you do not have lots of homework. Then you do not have lots of homework. Alright, so again, inverse negates the original conditional. So this is called negating the if and then. So if you hear us say negate the if and then, we want you to write the inverse of your condition. Alright, and then finally our contrapositive, combining those two together. We switch it and negate it. Switch and negate, switch and negate. So contrapositive. If you do not have lots of homework, then you are not a student. So notice we switched them and we negated them. So if you do not have lots of homework, then you are not a student. Alright, so again, converse, we switch our hypothesis and conclusion. Inverse, we negate the original statement. And contrapositive, we switch and negate. Now notice, well actually, with this example, it's probably, each of these are probably true. Most likely, if you have lots of homework, you are a student. Most likely, if you're not a student, then you do not have lots of homework. And most likely, if you do not have lots of homework, then you're not a student. This may be not always the case, but it's probably true. But it's not necessarily always going to be that way. It's possible for a conditional statement to not always be true. Likewise, our converse, our inverse, and our contrapositive aren't necessarily always going to be true either. So let's take a look at this last statement here. When the original statement, our conditional statement, is true, the contrapositive is always true. Remember that contrapositive is switch and negate. When the original is false, the contrapositive is always false. So basically the contrapositive and the conditional go together. They're either both true or both false. Alright, so our conditional and our contrapositive go together. They're either both true or both false. Similarly, the converse, which is just switching, and inverse, which is just negating, are either both true or both false. They do not have to be the same as the original statement. Okay, so the converse and the inverse go together. The converse and the inverse are either both true or both false. So you can maybe think of it this way. Your conditional is your most original, your basic sentence. The contrapositive is the one you've done the most work to. So kind of the ends of the extreme. Those go together. And then the middle ones, converse and inverse, go together. So again, conditional and contrapositive are either both true or both false. And the converse and inverse are either both true or both false. Right. So this is really the basics of our notes for today. Now we have some examples on the back. I'm going to go ahead and go through that first one, and then I want you to pause the video and try the other ones on your own. And then resume the video and double check to see if you got the correct answers. Right. So let's take a look at the next page, or the back side. So this first problem. If it snows, then school will be canceled. It's a nice if-then statement there. I'm going to go ahead and use a highlighter here. So if it snows, that's going to be my P statement. That's going to be the hypothesis. Then school will be canceled. That's going to be my conclusion. If it snows, then school will be canceled. That's going to be my Q. Okay, so converse. Again, we just simply switched it. So if school is canceled, then it's no. Alright, easy enough. Inverse, we're going to negate both pieces of the original. So if it did not snow, or if it does not snow, is probably a better way to say it, then school will not be canceled. Then school will not be canceled. Okay, and then contrapositive, flip and negate, switch and negate. Alright, so contrapositive. If school is not canceled, then it did not snow. If school is not canceled, then it did not snow. And I don't know if you remember last year, but there was a day where that was certainly not true. One of our first snowy days of the winter season. We had snow, they didn't cancel it, and it was a rough go trying to get to school. I don't know if you guys remember that. So that's not always true. But, so there we have converse, inverse, and contrapositive. And again, remember, it's not necessarily that it's going to be a true statement. We'll be analyzing that later with truth tables. And that's actually a fun time as well. Okay, so I want you to pause the video and try these next ones, the remaining examples on your notes. And then go ahead and resume the video to see if you have the correct answers. Then after that, you're going to be working on your lesson 4 homework. And you then can work on lesson 4 homework. Keep checking your assignment 3 homework from last class. I know you probably have some questions with it. So make sure you're asking each other questions. Don't just copy the answers and the work from the keys that I have posted. Do not just copy it. I want you to understand why you're doing what you're doing, so you can take a look at the work to see how to do it, but don't just simply copy it. And please do work with one another and help each other out on that. And then finally, you could also be working on your quiz 1 corrections. So remember, next class, you have the quiz that we would have taken today. That's still going to be only over lessons 2 and 3. That's Euclid, our vocab sheet, and the postulates and theorems we talked about last class. It will not include lesson 4. So next class, on Wednesday, you will have your quiz over lessons 2 and 3. And what will be due is you're going to turn in your lesson 3 homework, what you should have today, but I will collect it next class. I will also be collecting your lesson 4 homework, and I'll be collecting your quiz corrections. All right, so make sure you're using your time wisely right now to be working on this. Okay, so again, pause the video, work on these next problems, and then I'm going to resume it and have you check your answers. Have fun! Alright, so hopefully you have completed the remaining problems on the notes. Let's go ahead and take a look at them. Number 2 says, if I am in geometry class, then I am having fun. Of course. So the converse, we switch it. If I am having fun, then I am in geometry class. Inverse, we negate it. If I am not in geometry class, then I am not having fun. Contrapositive, negate and switch. If I am not having fun, then I am not in geometry class. Clearly. Alright, number 3, attribute to the great state. Given the hypothesis and conclusion, write a conditional statement. Then write the converse and the inverse of the conditional. Okay, so our hypothesis is I am at Cedar Point. The conclusion, I'm in Ohio. If you don't know what Cedar Point is, then in the last 2 minutes of class, you may get on your phone and Google Cedar Point. It's awesome. Alright, conditional. Our original statement. If I am at Cedar Point, then I am in Ohio. The great state, of course. So then our converse, we switch it. If I am in Ohio, then I'm at Cedar Point. And the inverse, we negate the original. If I am not at Cedar Point, then I'm not in Ohio. Alright? Notice not all those statements are true. You can be in Ohio, but not at Cedar Point. That is possible. And again, we'll deal with truth tables next unit. Alright, then number 4. Gru's minions look like Twinkies in overalls. Alright, so our converse. If they look like Twinkies in overalls, then they are Gru's minions. Our inverse. If they are not Gru's minions, then they don't look like Twinkies in overalls. Contrapositive. Switch and negate. If they don't look like Twinkies in overalls, then they are not Gru's minions. Alright. So number 5, it's going to depend on what you wrote as to what the answer will be. So you can turn to the person next to you and have you both check each other's original and the contrapositive to make sure you've done it right. But again, you have finished your notes for today. Go ahead and work on either lesson 3 correcting, lesson 4 homework that you will be getting or have already gotten, and then quiz 1 correcting. And remember, you have your quiz 2 next class over lessons 2 and lessons 3. Thanks guys, see you Wednesday.